Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special show. I think you're going to enjoy it quite a bit. We're going to get a lot of information out to you very quickly. I'm Leon Bibb. I'm your host today, and I'm honored to be a part of this esteemed panel called Your Voice Matters. Your Vote Matters, I should say. The panel is the work of Women Vote. That's Women Organized to Educate. Now, this is a new group of Cleveland's own professional women who came together as a result of being homebound during the pandemic. They decided that this election year was too important not to provide answers to questions voters may have relating to voting in the upcoming general election. So after several Zoom meetings strategizing on what they could do and how to accomplish their objectives, they identified several agenda items to give voters the tools necessary to make educated and informed decisions when it comes to voting in Ohio elections. One of the group's first steps was to develop a website which provides answers to commonly asked questions on the minds of voters. Next, they decided to bring together a group of professionals to answer tougher questions voters may be thinking about. It is their hope that an informed voter will be well prepared and comfortable to cast the vote, believing and knowing that the vote truly does matter. The Women Vote new website is Women Vote, voteohio2020.com. And it will provide answers to voters' questions as well as post future events. Today's panel, Your Vote Matter, kicks off with the first of two panels, I should say. This is our first panel discussion, and the panelists who will be answering questions provided by Women Vote are Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, the Democrat from the 11th Congressional District of Ohio, James Robineau, who's a partner with Thomas Hine and is an author of a book called Ballots and Bullets, INAJO Davis-Chappelle, she's a partner with Ulmer and Byrne, and a board member and former board chairman of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, and the Reverend MARVIN MCMICKLE, who's pastor emeritus of Antioch Baptist Church and former president of the NAACP in Cleveland, Ohio. Many thanks for our guests for being with us. We're going to have quite a discussion. I think we're going to have quite a discussion today. So why don't we begin with our first question? And I'm going to send that to Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. Congresswoman, it's been reported that nearly 100 million blacks and women did not vote in the 2016 election. Why do you think this year's election is more important and election is important for all people to vote? Why do you think that?
Well, I think it's important for a number of reasons. Obviously, when we vote, we show our power. The one thing that I have learned in this business of ours, this business of being an elected official, is kind of the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. People want to know that you are involved because if you're not, they tend to ignore you. Let me just give you some information, Leon. I think that will put all this in perspective. In 2016, the election in Wisconsin was decided by 23,000 votes. 93,000 black people in the city of Milwaukee alone did not vote. In Florida, it was decided by 113,000 votes. 379,000 black people did not vote. In Michigan, 11,000 votes. 277,000 black people in Detroit did not vote. You get where I'm going. We can change elections. We can decide who represents us. Because if we don't, we get representation that we may not want. We have people say it doesn't matter. It does matter. They say it doesn't make any difference who's there. I promise you, I'm a much different representative than somebody who does not look like me. Because I come from a different set of experiences and background. And so I think my diversity is my strength. So I think that we do need to understand that every single vote, in fact, does count, that it does matter, and I can go on with more and more numbers. If these people that did not vote had voted, we may have had a different outcome, maybe the same. I don't know who they would have voted for, but they would have made the difference.
In other words, every vote counts is what you're saying, right? Congresswoman Marcia Fudge? Yeah. Reverend Dr. Martin McMickle, I've known you for years, I'm inclined to believe you would agree with everything that the Congresswoman just said.
I would agree 150%. I think it's really tragic that we have to acknowledge that everything we do not like about the current incumbent in the White House is a direct result of a certain level of black voter apathy. Whatever the role of the Russians might have been in bending the election in one way or another, her numbers that she just shared from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, from Wisconsin, Milwaukee, from Michigan, Detroit. I'm not sure about the numbers for Ohio, but there were enough African American voters across this country who, either because they did not like Hillary Clinton as a person or were not prepared to vote for a woman as the president, because of those choices, we now have had 4 years of hell. If they did not like what Donald Trump has done for the last 4 years, they really ought to just be quiet, because they're not voting in 2016 really should have taken away their right to complain in the intervening years. We have got to vote in massive numbers in order to free ourselves from, listen, from my point of view, from the incompetence, the mismanagement, the immorality, the illegality of the last 4 years.
Let's bring in INAJO Davis Chappell. You're a former board chairwoman of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections. We talk a lot about the mail-in ballot. Are we going to be able to handle everything at the Board of Elections? Are the ballots going to be able to get in on time? And I call upon you to speak on that because of your history with the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections. INAJO Chappell.
Thank you, Leon. I appreciate that. Obviously, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and so we are in somewhat unprecedented and uncharted waters, but voters should be absolutely confident that we at the Board of Elections are ready, able, and stand prepared to count every ballot that's cast, whether it be by vote by mail, early in-person voting, and/or on election day. So I know that there's issues or concerns around whether to vote by mail or in person, and we're ready to address those challenges. It is imperative that people come out to vote, and they should be assured that we are following all manner of protocols that have been indicated by our public health officials in terms of in-person voting. There will be lines if people elect to vote by mail. In every presidential cycle, there are lines, and the lines are going to be long, and the situation is going to be exacerbated simply because we have to sanitize behind every voter. We're taking temperatures at the polling locations. We have to socially distance. But that being said, it doesn't diminish the urgency and the need for folks to really come out and exercise their ballot.
What happens if somebody's temperature runs high at in-person voting? What do you do with that person? Does that person get a chance to vote anyway?
Yes, they do. But we are implementing a process by where those folks who have elevated temperatures beyond what is stipulated will be segregated to the side, right at the front of our polling location, and they will be able to vote, and they will be able to exit immediately after they cast their ballot.
While I got you here, and we're talking about mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, sometimes there is a confusion as to they really are one and the same, aren't they? Absentee ballot is a mail-in ballot, correct?
They really are. They really are. I mean, we've had no fault absentee voting in Ohio since 2005, I believe. I mean, it's not a mystery. It shouldn't be a mystery. We shouldn't allow folks to create some confusion. A lot of this is targeted voter confusion, and voters should not be confused. They are able to vote by mail or cast their votes early in person. So those would be the two mechanisms that we call absentee voting.
I want to get a comment now from James Robineau. Jim, you and I have talked over the years, and you've got a book out. In fact, I bought your book here, Ballots and Bullets, right here, James Robineau. And I'm interested in, you use the word ballot on there. Ballot was key in this time period you're writing about, 1968 Cleveland. James Robineau, tell me, do you see similarities between 1968 and 2020 when it comes to the question of ballots?
Yes, I mean, there are great similarities. And by the way, that name, Ballots and Bullets, comes from a speech of Malcolm X here in Cleveland at Corey Methodist Church in 1964. And he was emphasizing how important it was to vote. because if people didn't vote and they weren't successful, then it was going to be the bullet revolution. And he preferred that people vote. So he came and gave this speech, the ballot or the bullet. But he said, if things don't change, we're going to see revolution. So that was 1964. And in 1968, we had a lot of chaos across the country, including here in Cleveland. We had a shootout between Black nationalists and Cleveland police. And during that entire year, Dr. King is killed, Bobby Kennedy is killed. We had the anti-war protests and so forth. So in some ways, very similar to where we are today. And in fact, that resulted in an election that was a counter revolution, the Nixon counter revolution, that has put us in this cycle we've been in for the last 50 years of this counter revolution. And so it's very important, I think, for people to vote this year because we face very similar circumstances. And there is already a counter revolution building right now, and people have to get out and vote so that counter revolution doesn't overwhelm the people who are trying to peacefully protest and change things today.
Do you see this, the Black Lives Movement and the other protests which are going on are having an instrumental part in perhaps in encouraging people to vote?
I do. I think that it's an energizing movement, and I think that that people are very much focused on race the way they've never been focused before, frankly, in any election. So I think it's a great thing that's happening right now. The concern and the care has to be over the reaction that people have if violence happens. And, it was Bobby Kennedy who came to Cleveland right after Dr. King was assassinated, the very next day. And he said, violence and mob rule gets you nowhere. Any protest has to be peaceful, and people have to be careful because if too much violence happens, it does create a counter revolution and a counter reaction.
Leon, could I just interject that the same set of numbers that the Congresswoman used for 2016 were at work in 1968? It was very possible that Hubert Humphrey could have won that election, except for a very low Black voter turnout.
That's true.
It was a low voter turnout. And by the way, for my panelists, feel free to jump in on each other if you would like. Don't wait for me to ask a question. It'll make my job a lot easier if there's something that you want to comment on. Let's go back to this question of colorism and racism and sexism and how it's played a role in the last 3 presidential elections. What impact, Marcia Fudge, do you think this year's presidential election will have based on a mixed race woman of color, Senator Harris of California, running for the vice presidency? What impact do you think that will have, Marcia Fudge?
Can I just answer this other question? One more thing that I wanted to say about it, Leon. To me, not voting is the most selfish thing you can do. You may not think about it as something that affects your life personally. It may not affect me. I mean, I've gone to good schools. I've worked hard. I've had a good job. I can retire and be comfortable. Most people cannot. So those people need to realize that maybe they don't have kids in school, but I have nieces and nephews in school that need to go to decent schools. And we can't get that if there's not somebody in place to make sure it happens. So you have to vote. My mother is on Social Security and Medicare, and she needs it. And so if we don't vote, we don't take care of our senior citizens. We need to take care of people who are sick and disabled and make sure people have health care. So even though it may not affect you, if you don't vote, it affects all the people you care about. And it is just selfish that you would not do something to protect the people you care about. We have right now in this society, and this is going back to your question, because of social media and so many other things, we have found a way to make Black people feel so hopeless and depressed that we become paralyzed. We're paralyzed because we think that nothing will change. We have eroded or destroyed people's confidence and faith in government and any other institution. I think what a Kamala Harris does on the ticket is brings back people's hope, because what she represents is what we see her and we see ourselves. And so I think the energy and the hope that she brings back will make a difference, because it's just like with Barack Obama. We vote heavy for people that look like us, that we know care about us. Almost anybody can see themselves in Kamala Harris, whether you're Black, whether you're Asian, whether you're mixed race, whether you're an immigrant. She brings together all of the various factions of this country. And I think it's exhilarating. So I think it is going to make a difference, a tremendous difference, because she's smart and she cares.
INAJO.
I was going to jump in, Leon. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Please do. Please take a piece of that.
I was going to say, we are anticipating at the Board of Elections a significant uptick in turnout for the very reasons the Congresswoman has mentioned. It's a historic ticket. And while we were noting the fact that voter turnout was down in 2016, nothing compares to the historic turnout we had when President Barack Obama was first elected. But we are anticipating a significant uptick in voter turnout. The Secretary of State has estimated that there's likely to be a 75% voter turnout this election. What that translates to for Cuyahoga County is likely to be 670,000 people voting, potentially. And that's total ballots. And of that number, we're not quite sure. There could be, the uptick in vote by mail could be somewhere around 500,000 ballots. It remains to be seen, but we need to ensure that people understand that they need to be confident that they can rely in the Board of Elections to count every ballot that is cast. The messaging needs to be clear that there will be some wait, but we have every reason to expect, and we hope there will be confidence in the voting electorate to understand that we are poised and prepared for what we anticipate will be significant voter turnout for this election.
Might it take a while before we get all of the votes counted in this country if we have a huge voter turnout and so many ballots are going to be mailed in?
Absolutely, it is going to take a while. We have in the past, been having folks saying, hurry, 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 when will we get the results? And we have, for the last 13 years that I've been on the Board of Elections, said the goal is to be accurate and not quick. So, given the volume, you're absolutely right. Given the volume of ballots that we expect, we have a two-page ballot here in Cuyahoga County. That's over 1 million pages of ballot that we will be counting. But when you factor in the increased numbers, those that will choose appropriately so to vote in person, with the social distancing, with the protocols that we have to take to make sure people are safe, it will take longer to vote. But it is so important. I'm hoping that voters will stay for hours as if necessary. And we will do our jobs to make sure that everything is counted accurately, and we will produce the results when we have accurate results to produce.
Leon, can I just add one thing here?
Yeah, I want you to. Please, Jim.
Okay. So Ohio has always been the bellwether state. For a century. As Ohio went, so went the nation. And the reason is that Ohio has always been very evenly balanced between Republicans and Democrats. In 2016, that changed in kind of a material way. And I think it was because of what Congresswoman Fudge said, which is the African-American vote was suppressed. It wasn't as motivated. So to answer your question, I think they will be motivated this time. In the urban areas, particularly Cleveland, makes a big difference in balancing this state the way it should be balanced. And I think if there is real energy, which I think is brought to this ticket, I think it will make a difference in this election. And Ohio could actually be in the category that could turn blue again.
Are you very much concerned about that vote being suppressed or not enough of an open road for people to vote? Are you concerned about that here in the state of Ohio?
Well, yeah, I mean, two things concern me. One is we are in the pandemic, as INAJO says, that, this is scary for people, and it's scary for them to stand in line to vote. I mean, as many people as can vote by mail-in, all the better, I think, for us. And the Board of Elections here in Cuyahoga County has a great website, as does Women Vote, but it's BOE.CUYAHOGACOUNTY, all one word, .gov. go there, get your mail-in vote, and do it that way. Because I think a lot of people, the thing that concerns me is people are going to be concerned about going to the polls, and I think that concern can be addressed by mail-in voting. So that's one big thing right now. And the other is that there's just so much misinformation right now coming out of the government about things like mail-in voting that I think it is causing some real problems with people being concerned that there's going to be integrity in the election and therefore just not voting. So those are the two things that concern me the most.
Well, I just want to add one thing. If we could, not only for a lot of people don't have computers so that they're not able to access the website, but it's as simple as a phone call to 216-443-VOTE. And there's a whole menu of options a voter can avail themselves of in terms of, voting information, checking their ballot, how to vote by mail. And so for those who do not have access to the website, please do call.
Leon, could I insert something about the importance of a large voter turnout this time? There is an incumbent who has already said that if he loses, it's because the election has been rigged. Any close vote, any vote where the outcome could be up in the air, a percentage point here or there in a state here or there, could lay the groundwork for some unprecedented actions on the part of the existing government. I think there needs to be a voter turnout that is so wide and so compelling and the results so beyond question that it just takes the rug away from any notion that it's been stolen. It will not be stolen. It will be taken away by very large and very compelling voter turnout. And this program, I think, contributes to the reasons for doing just that.
And Leon, can I just add this? Let me just add this one thing to show you how important our vote is. Just this week, my office received phone calls indicating that people in our community are receiving robocalls saying to them if they vote by mail, they will be investigated by the government. This week, those calls are coming out. When the Russians and the Chinese decided to interfere with our elections in a big way, all intelligence reports are saying the first people they attack is us, because they feel like if they can keep Black people from voting, that they can control who wins an election. And it goes back to the numbers I started with. If they can depress or suppress the Black vote, then they don't have any worries. But it is always us that they attack.
James Robenalt, does that sound like 1968 in your book, Ballots and Bullets? Does that sound like 1968 when you wrote about it?
1968 was definitely a year in which there was so much upheaval in racial upheaval that had happened over the last few years leading up to 1968. And then, here in Cleveland, we had Huff in 66, and then we had Glenville in 68. And there were large numbers of African Americans who were just totally disenchanted with their government. They felt that they were the subject of police abuse, which they were. And, there was this fighting that broke out, which was unprecedented in Cleveland. So I think that back then what was happening is people were feeling so alienated, Black people were feeling so alienated from their government that they took up arms. So it was a time when, people were not as invested in believing in their system of government, even though they just elected Carl Stokes, the first African-American mayor in 1967. The violence in 68 in the summer undercut a lot of what was going on, the Cleveland Now program and other things. So it was a difficult time for African-Americans.
Yeah. Marvin McMickle, how do we get around that? How do we get around people feeling that they don't matter anymore? You were the president of the NAACP in Cleveland for many years. You deal with this, and you still deal with that. How do we get around, Marvin McMickle, of people feeling that they don't matter and that it doesn't matter what I do, whether I vote or don't vote? How do we get around that?
Yeah, I think there are so many instances where the presence and participation of African Americans in the voting process has just proven that not to be the case if the playing field is level. So, I mean, there are African American mayors, there are African American members of Congress, there are African Americans serving at every level of government. And as the Congresswoman said at the very beginning, the presence of persons who've come out of that experience and who represent people who are living in that experience makes all of the difference in the world. So we are, in fact, voting not simply because it is a duty, we're voting because it is a self-interest. Two things are the case. One, if you do not vote, somebody else will. Somebody is going to win. If you do not vote, they will probably not take your concerns very much to heart, even if you call them. I remember in 1966, I was living in Chicago, which is my hometown, and Jesse Jackson had just come to start Operation Breadbasket. He was sitting outside of Mayor Daley's office waiting for about 2 hours, and finally Daley summoned him to come in. And Jesse began to make his demands of what he wanted in terms of governmental action. And Mayor Richard J. Daley asked Jesse Jackson, how many votes do you control in this ward or this ward or this ward? And if you don't control X numbers of votes, then don't come back until you do. That was a demonstration of raw political South Side Chicago politics with which I grew up. When we had Harold Washington as the mayor, it made all the difference in the world. And now there is an African-American woman who is the mayor there. When we vote, we win. When we do not vote, somebody else wins and rules, and we simply have to deal with the consequences of those decisions.
Let's go back to 1963. It's been 57 years since the I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial there in Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King gave that historic speech. It's been 57 years exactly and a few days since that took place. 1963, not everybody even had the right to vote, certainly in many states. This is before the Voting Rights Act. Didn't even have the right, those who went to Washington, D.C. From the South certainly couldn't even stop at gas stations and use the restroom or get hotels in the various hotels along the way. A lot has changed. But did the 63 March on Washington affect a lot of the change that we see today? And will the protests that we are seeing today, will that affect what we'll see tomorrow? Marcia.
Okay. Yes, I think it will affect it. If you remember, in 1963, after the march, shortly thereafter, when you combine Bloody Sunday and the march, in 64, we got the Civil Rights Act as a direct result of what they were seeing, of the uprising of people of color. In 1965, we got the Voting Rights Act. We got the higher education. We got all of these things done because we all of a sudden had the right to vote, and we exercised the right to vote. So I do think that the people's voices, I mean, in our Constitution, we say that we are a government for the people, by the people. If the people continue to raise their voices the way they are today, and they are doing it so loudly that everybody has to take notice. That is why they're trying to shift the narrative or twist it to the point where they're saying, oh, these are just violent people in the street. What they are exposing is the institutional racism that we have experienced for a long time. And I think James is right about this. This is the first time I can remember in my lifetime that we've had the kind of discussions and the kind of recognition of what institutional racism has done to Black people and brown people in this country. And yes, I do think it'll make a difference.
Could I interject something here? Because I'm not at all disagreeing. I just want to give another side of what happened after the March on Washington. It was about 1 month later that the Ku Klux Klan planted a bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church. And then it was immediately after the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that Southern Democrats began to flee the Democratic Party. And that became sort of the beginning of the change of the South from a solidly Democratic area of the country to now a pretty solidly Republican area of the country, pretty solidly conservative. So the backlash that we've all been talking about one step forward, one step back, one step forward by African Americans and those who are concerned about inclusivity and justice. But there's always this reaction from people who think that their power is being eroded and their influence is being undercut. I think that the current incumbent of the White House is still drawing on the sentiments, the resistance to the events of 1963. What we're dealing with today is a direct continuation of those 4 girls in Birmingham, Alabama, who were going to Sunday school and a bomb went off. It was the other side's message back to Martin Luther King Jr. You gave a great speech, but this is not going to be an easy road for you because we don't have any intention of giving up right now. And I think it's still going on to this day.
You seem to be saying that the past is tied to the present and the present is tied to the future. So the past and the future are linked.
You know, the phrase is the past is prologue. The events of the past are prologue to things you can anticipate unless there is a substantial change in the trajectory. But if there is still this resistance to the inclusion of new voices and new opinions into the political arena, if it's still going to be cheat and cheat and cheat and lie and lie and lie in order to hold on to power, then exactly, I think the sentiments of 63 will be the sentiments of 2020.
And by the way, Leon, let me just add one thing. Dr. King had really deep roots here in Cleveland. You know, in 1963, he came out of Birmingham jail where he wrote his letter from Birmingham jail. He came to Cleveland to raise bail money to get people out of jail. And, then the March on Washington, and then a month later, the Birmingham bombing. But then he was back here in 65, and then he came back in 67 to help Carl Stokes get elected as the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city, the Black Power movement. So there is that change that happens, but every time it's happened, violence has come in to try to stop it. And that, King was killed 5 months after Stokes was elected mayor. And then that violence leads to other violence. So it is a tough struggle because it is always met with violence.
Let me mention something else. I want to bring in INAJO CHAPPELL. I want to ask you a question, INAJO. I'm old enough to remember that when I was in Cleveland Public Schools, we studied a lot of civics. I understood what was going on. In fact, in the 11th or the 12th grade, we had to know all of the cabinet members in the John Kennedy administration. So I've got some age on me right now. Are we studying enough? Are we studying enough civics and political science in our high schools right now so that kids grow up understanding how our government works?
Well, I come from a family of educators, so I do appreciate that question. I don't think our history is demonstrated in textbooks in the way and explained and provided in a way that is real and frank or accurate, first and foremost. And frankly, I am not so sure that our kids are getting the history or that our young people are being educated in the ways that we were for lots of different reasons. And that's not that's not to denigrate the public education system. We do have a lot of work to do to educate voters and to educate black voters in particular about their history. Because to me, if you have a sense of your history, there would be the history that's been talked about here today by the panelists, there would be no hesitation, no reticence at all to stand in line and to not let fear paralyze you, to be concerned about or not to exercise the right to vote. So I don't think the history is being taught. I don't think the history is even accurately presented or realistically presented in the textbooks that our kids are using. That's just my own personal view.
You would agree,
Leon,
that go ahead.
I was going to say, I do have a bill. I have a bill in the Congress right now that requires that if you receive certain funding from the federal government, you must teach Black history in your curriculum. It has almost 200 co-sponsors because of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and shaming people into understanding that Black history is American history. because we've basically built this country. And so I think that, and that is why a lot of these young people are so impatient, because if they don't know their history, they are more, in my opinion, to be more like a Stokely or a Rapp than they are to be a Martin or a Malcolm, because they want instant change. And that is another reason I think this is going to be more violent than people think.
My hope is that the protesters will change all of the power of the protest, which is significant, that it translates into the power of the vote. And that's what our history teaches us. And so I'm hopeful, and we're ready. If there's any message that I can communicate today as a member of the Board of Elections, it is that we need folks to come out and vote. And whether they exercise that right from with our Vote by Home program, or if they come to the polls to vote, we are ready, and they must just be prepared to be there with us.
Can I hold a book up, Leon, that I want folks to at least see and be aware of? We've talked about Martin King and we've talked about Malcolm X a little. This is a book called The Sword and the Shield by a man named Peniel Joseph, African-American writer. His point was that the violence on the part of white society after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, and of course the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, became so intense that he found himself beginning to question the degree to which his approach to nonviolent social protest was going to be successful. And at the same time, as Malcolm X became increasingly disillusioned with the strategies of the Nation of Islam, he found himself gravitating more in the direction of political engagement where King was. It was an interesting time. The two of them only met once, and that was in 1964, during the debate for the Civil Rights Bill. And Malcolm was dead before they signed the Voting Rights Act. But these two people can teach us a lot about how African Americans have been struggling with what is the appropriate way for them to face both the political world and this horrific violence.
The sword versus the shield is what you're saying.
The sword and the shield.
And we have to make a decision.
Or the ballot or the bullet, which was Martin King's. Yeah.
Jim Robineau says we have to make a decision between the ballot and the bullet. This is his book, and we're with Carl Stokes on the cover right there. And
that was a
Jim,
quote
you
from
want to talk
Malcolm X,
about that? Jim, you want to talk about the ballot versus the bullet, or the sword versus the shield?
What Reverend McMickle says is exactly right, that Martin Luther King became more radicalized as he got older. And Malcolm X moved more towards the middle himself. And in fact, it's interesting that Malcolm X visited Selma, weeks before he was assassinated. And he went to see Dr. King, but Dr. King was in jail. So he talked to his wife and said, he's here doing the right thing, but I'm here to show that if change doesn't happen through peaceful means, I'm here to show that there's the bullet behind it. And, there's got to be something behind if things don't work. And if the democracy is not working, if our government has failed us, then, you're not going to get there by singing "We Shall Overcome." He said that when he came here to Cleveland, that's not how America was born. It wasn't George Washington singing "We Shall Overcome." There was a violent revolution that made this country. So it's a very interesting dynamic. That book is a great book that was referenced, but it really does show change needs to happen peacefully. People need to vote. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, it just, without minimizing the importance of and the historical importance of the violence and the protest. I mean, the power really is in the vote. And I think if we look at the ways in which the system is not rigged, but there are inherent structural barriers to suppress the vote, even in our community. The fact that we only have one drop box in our very tiny parking lot at the Board of Elections is a systemic structural problem for me as one of 4 elections administrators. What sense does that make in a county that has 900,000 registered voters? The power, it seems to me, violence aside, the fear that folks have is that people will vote. And if they vote, there will be more change that could ever happen and be produced as a byproduct of violence. And so, there are structural, systematic things embedded in our legal statutes that impact voters. And this is black voters, white voters. These are all voters. My job is to cast every ballot. A drop box doesn't know if a ballot is a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot. So why the heck do we not have multiple ballots? That it's in the process of being litigated, but I'm just saying, and when we talk about the voter turnout being low, and we talk about misinformation, Russian interference, apathy, there are systemic problems that impede folks from having full enfranchisement.
Where can we have drop boxes? I mean, I put in my application for an absentee mail-in ballot, and I took it downtown to East 30th Street and Euclid Avenue at the Board of Elections and dropped it in the drop box myself because I wanted to make sure it got there. Where could we have other drop boxes that are off the property of the Board of Elections?
Right. Well, there's lots of ideas being floated around. We could have them potentially in libraries. I mean, we are running out of time as a practical matter. I mean, but we can do it. I mean, if we could get the approval, some bipartisan agreement to say, yes, we need to have multiple drop boxes other than 30th and Euclid at our administrative office, we could locate them in libraries. There's always where it would be easy to have security. Obviously, we need to secure those boxes. We could strategically place them maybe we could place them at the polling locations, in our communities. There's a number of ideas, but the thought that we would delay or drag our feet in figuring out something that's so common sense, and there's an issue about whether the statutory language permits the delivery of the ballot to more than one place other than our administrative office. And I, as a lawyer, I don't see the language prohibiting us from doing that. We have received instruction from our Secretary of State that we are not to implement multiple drop boxes. And so obviously we are obligated to follow that direction. But I've been hearing the same thing that you've identified, Leon. I am hearing voters saying, hey, I am going to vote by mail because I don't want to come to the polls necessarily, but I am going to bring my ballot to the Board of Elections. We're in the process of figuring out logistically how that's going to work. We will have lines of people voting in, and we have pictures from pre-pandemic presidential election with lines wrapped around our Board of Elections building. And they run right in front of the parking lot where the drop box is situated. So it just makes no sense that we wouldn't be permitted to have more than one drop box. But please, we are in the process of figuring out how to logistically to make that work. Because we are hearing just that. People are going to vote by mail, but because of their lack of confidence in the post office, they are going to bring those ballots to us.
What about somebody has talked about the possibility of a polling place being at the NBA basketball arenas. Is that something that could take place?
Well, the reason we are in the process of working that out with the Cavaliers and having the arena serve as a polling location is because we had to close other polling locations. So it's not, the idea does springboard the idea of having vote centers. There's been talk about having vote centers, which would alleviate a lot of congestion and that kind of thing. But that's not what the arena location is going to be. It's actually substituting for another polling location in our downtown area.
Leon, can I just say this one thing that I think is important as well? I'm the chair of the subcommittee on elections for the House of Representatives. And one of the things that we have found is that people have become disappointed and almost brought to the place where they don't want to vote because of all of the little hoops we put in place to make them vote, so that they can vote. And when you start saying to a person that your form of ID has to be either a birth certificate or a passport, I don't know many Black people who know where their birth certificate is. And if you've never gone overseas, you don't have a passport. Or they'll say a driver's license. If you are a person that lives, especially in certain places in the South, they don't drive. So They restrict what you can use. And then in addition to which, when you send things by mail, they'll say they want, in Georgia, for instance, they have an exact signature match. My signature when I was 18 is very different from my signature now. That is when I filled out that card and signed it. And so what they have done is put impediments in the way so that even people who who do go to vote get discouraged because they feel that their vote is not going to count. It's going to be thrown out. And so you have the dual tracks. You have the one where it says, okay, I want to make sure that my vote gets counted, and INAJO handles that piece of it. But then you have the other people who already are believing no matter what I do, they're not going to count my vote. I don't know what to do. And so they do nothing.
And let me just insert again the point that the Congresswoman was raising from the start, kind of piggybacking on your question, Leon, about what difference does it make. Everything that INAJO just described is the result of the political orientation of the current Secretary of State. A different Secretary of State out of a different political orientation that saw voting in a different way, more inclusive and less exclusive, would have found a way to resolve this. They don't have this problem in Colorado because the Secretary of State has made sure that the drop boxes are available at fire stations, on street corners. I mean, everywhere. They're secure. You can't pick one up and take it away. You can't break into it and take the ballot out. It is itself the result of not voting or allowing persons of a particular party to dominate the electoral process. And this is voter suppression. This is the most conspicuous form of voter suppression, that you've got to get in a car or take a bus or take an Uber or walk or bike. Suppose you live, way out in the extremities of this county. You got to come to 30th and Euclid to drop off a ballot in the box. It is suppression. Let's not call it anything other than an attempt to discourage whole groups of persons from voting. And it will be successful unless we inform people that it's important to resist this. And if we can find a way to get more drop boxes available. But make no mistake about it, that this is happening is itself a political act, the result of previous votes.
But the bottom line, panel, and all of you, feel free to join in on this. My belief is, and this is not just my belief, this is the truth. The bedrock of democracy is the vote. Democracy literally means the people rule. The people rule. It is the bedrock, the vote. How do we get folks to understand that and to take that into their hearts, as you have and as I have? How do we get them to fully understand you've got to do what you've got to do to vote, and you've got to get there? And how do we get the politicians who are in charge to understand that?
Leon, your point is so well taken, but let me just remind the viewers, not the panel, that the vote has always come at us incrementally. When the country was started, it was pretty clear who was going to have the right to vote. It was going to be white men over the age of 21 who owned 100 acres of land. And from that time on, we've been trying to gradually expand the number of persons, white men who were a little poorer. And then for a very brief period of time, black men with the 15th Amendment. And then voter suppression kicked in. And then women got the right to vote. White women got the right to vote in 1920. And black women got the right to vote in 1965. So we've been working on this experiment in democracy from the very beginning. We are the ones who have to push it to its fulfillment to make sure that everybody who is able to vote, because other folks died for the right to vote, that we're now standing on their shoulders and casting that ballot. Not to vote is not only unpatriotic, it is as the Congresswoman said, it is an act of selfishness. I don't want to cast my vote because they aren't going to do anything. No, we paid too high a price for this. We've got to vote.
Jim Robenalt, take a piece of this. Take a piece of what Marvin said and expand on that from your vantage point, Jim Robenalt.
From my vantage point, the difference is going to happen in this country when young people vote. Right now, way too many young people sit on their hands because they are cynical about the process, as Reverend McMickle was talking about. But they have got to understand they can change the world. And, if all the younger people who could vote voted, we would have a very different world. And at some point they are going to wake up. But I think our job, our generation, my generation, I'm 64, is to talk to my kids and make sure they talk to their friends and make sure they're all registered and vote. That's the big area where we really need to activate people and get them believing that they can have power and exercise power.
Do you sense significant change taking place in this country, Jim Robineau? I'm asking you this because of your being white on our panel. Do you see significant change taking place with the Black Lives Matter movement and whites being involved in this movement? Is this different than it was in the 1960s?
In a very material way, it is different. People saw George Floyd killed publicly, and that was so horrific to people that it activated them. It really generated this, you cannot watch that video, and it's very difficult to watch without coming away with some sort of humanity to say that this has got to change. We can't keep this up. My concern is this. My concern is that there is right now no principal leader like a Dr. King or someone else like that who's out there who is the focus of all this. And there's no focused agenda. I know a lot of people have ideas about what to do, but you've had, for example, this whole idea of defunding the police, which has thrown off a lot of people thinking that people want to get rid of police departments altogether. It's a very different message. It means change, reform the police, and so forth. So I think that this is a moment, but it doesn't seem to be organized behind any one person or any one exact agenda. Here's what we've got to do. I think hopefully that will come, but it's not there right now.
Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, take a piece of that. What do you see as you look at where we are in 2020?
I think that the difference between where we are now and maybe where we were in 65 and 68 is that young people today have a very strong sense of justice and injustice. I don't know that everybody is to the whole race issue and wants to have that conversation, but they do know injustice. And so this is a spontaneous movement. I agree with Jim to the degree that that's what was wrong when the Panthers first started and when Black Lives first started. There was no direction, there was no agenda. But young people do very well with that. And it is young people, this is their time. All of us have had seminal moments in our lives that changed our lives. This is their time. And so even though they think about things differently than we do and their minds work differently, I think we need to maybe listen just a little more, but they really do understand clearly about justice and injustice. And so the Floyd killing and so many others has created within them a rage to make things right. The other thing I think that is important is that I try to tell people that voting is the only time in this country when everybody has the same voice. The only time that all of us have equal power is when we vote. So because they have done everything they could to try to make it more difficult, I served with John Lewis for 12 years. His whole life was dedicated to change. He would be the first to say to you, yes, there have been some progress. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. We need to convince young people that the way to make that change is to vote. And so when you start to say to them things like, well, let's look at the Supreme Court and the decisions they make, that comes as a result of a president appointing people to the Supreme Court. So you have to break it down to them so that they sometimes understand. But the other thing you have to do is find some way to reach into their hearts and say, this is your power. This is the way that you make change the way you want it to change. You look at the city of Cleveland. In the last election, they elected, I think, 4 city council people, I know for sure 3, who were just barely 30 years of age because they used their power. And so the more we get them engaged in this process, I think the more we're going to see progress. But I do believe that in their own minds, they're okay with not having a leader because what they are fighting for is justice.
INAJO CHAPPELL, the Congresswoman used the word rage about a minute ago, said there's a rage among a lot of people. INAJO, do you see that rage as translating over into to voter turnout?
Well, already we're seeing an uptick. Just this week, here by near the end of August, we've seen an increase of vote-by-mail applications to the tune of 120,000 more than we have seen in the past presidential elections. So something is happening. I don't know if it's rage or folks being, realizing that not to be paralyzed by fear, whether it's the immediacy of now, the urgency of now. But yes, we are seeing the protests, the concerns around injustice, I believe, translate, and just the reclamation of our principal values in this country as we see our democratic institutions being eroded. I think that voters, all voters, young people especially, are seeing that something has got to happen, and most recognize that it comes with a vote. As an elections administration official, it's important for me to say that we need a robust registration updating effort now until October 5th, when registration closes for the general election. So we need young people and every registered voter to go to our website or give a call to make sure between now and October 5th that their registrations are updated, if they've moved, if they've married, just to make sure. Now, we know that there will be no purges of any voters voting rolls in advance of this election. But in order to make our jobs easier and to ensure that the voting will not be impeded, we need people to just update their registrations, and we need people to register. Because I'm not completely sure that everybody that's enraged and out there protesting is a registered voter. I'm hoping that's the case, but I'm not so sure that's the case. And people are asking, you could see by the uptick in absentee ballot applications, when am I going to get? We can't start mailing ballots until October 6th. We will start then. But there's a big window now for people to update their registrations and in fact to register to vote. So I'm hoping that rage translates into registration and we get people on the roll so that they can vote.
A frequently asked question, INAJO, what about felons or former felons who are, can they vote? People who have felony records in their background, can they vote?
Sure, yeah. People are, there is a myth that unless you have your, crime sealed or your record sealed that you cannot vote. Ohio, and the difference is, and the confusion is because every state is different. Ohio is the state where absolutely, if you are not incarcerated, you have been released, and you are you can be on probation, you can be paroled. You absolutely have your voter rights restored automatically upon release. But here's the catch. We do cancel voter registrations when people have been convicted of a felony. So they have to re-register. They have to re-register in Ohio. So there is automatic reinstatement of a voting right for a felon that has been released from incarceration or is on parole or probation, but they must re-register to vote. So
What about high school kids, who will be 18 as of election day? If they were in school, in the building itself, could they register in the building, in their school building?
Yes, we had, I should say, a fairly extensive and robust program for 17-year-olds to register and, in fact, to work the polls. But the pandemic, obviously, schools are just reopening, many are not reopening in person. There's virtual distance learning. So we're not quite sure how those numbers will shake out this year. But in an ordinary scenario, we would have see a lot of 17-year-olds who have registered if they're going to turn 18 by the time the election rolls around. It's a little different in this pandemic.
I will tell you, as we are getting down, we've got a special surprise coming up on the broadcast in just a moment. But I will conclude this part of it with, in 1967, I was in the U.S. Army, and I was serving in Vietnam, and I voted absentee ballot from Vietnam in the election of Carl Stokes. I won't say how I voted, but I did. I voted for Carl. But I voted absentee, and it was a long process because it took 6 days for my letter to come to the Board of Elections to ask for an absentee ballot. 6 days for them to send me the absentee ballot. 6 more days for me to send it in. So it was a long process, but I wanted to be part of the election, and I was old enough to vote at the age of when I was in service in Vietnam. So I voted. I actually sat on a tree stump and cast my ballot and put it in the mail and wrote "free" up in the top of the corner that military people do, and got it to a post, our military postal installation, and they sent it over here. We've got something special for you right now. I'm going to send it over to Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, the Democrat from the 11th Congressional District in the state of Ohio. And she's got something special for us. I'm not sure what it is, but Marcia, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Leon. This has been a great panel, but I want you to know I have the privilege and the pleasure of bringing a special guest to our panel today. She is a member of the United States Senate. She is my colleague. She is a fierce fighter for the people. She is currently the vice presidential candidate for the United States for the Democratic Party, my good friend, Senator Kamala Harris.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for including me in this discussion. And thank you to Women Vote for your commitment to voter education. And Marcia Fudge, I cannot say enough about you, about your leadership, about your friendship, and your sisterhood. Thank you for all you are and all you do. And thank you to everyone for the work that you have been doing and continue to do, not only in this election year, but on all fronts every year. We need your vision and strength now more than ever. And of course, our country needs women more than ever right now to use our voices and our votes. 2020 marks 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment. And every day, it seems, we're confronted with new reasons for our vote to matter and to count. From the shooting of Jacob Blake and the murder of protesters in Kenosha, to hurricanes battering our coastlines, to the COVID crisis tearing through our communities. There is so much at stake in this election, both nationally and locally. But being tuned in doesn't necessarily mean people are ready to vote. It's a complicated year, and there are those trying to make it even harder. So we need organizations like this one, like you leaders, to lift up the veil on voting, to push out good information, and to keep people motivated no matter what obstacles come their way. On the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, we must remember the voices of those who have ushered us up to this point. Our great friend, our leader, a conscience of our nation, Congressman John Lewis, he told us, our vote is precious, almost sacred. And we know if our goal is to leave the nation better than we found it, following John Lewis's example is always the right thing to do. So thank you for all you are doing, and please keep up the sense of urgency that you have in empowering women to vote and to be heard. There has never been a more vital time for action and for the leadership of women like you. Thank you.
So many thanks, Senator Kamala Harris, vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket, running for the vice presidency. We appreciate her being on the broadcast today as well. And thank you, Marcia Fudge, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, for facilitating that and making all of that happen. Well, we're in our final few minutes here, so why don't we kind of close out things, and Marcia Fudge, Congresswoman, why don't you take 30 seconds and give us a final thought, and we'd kind of go around the horn here, and everybody will get a shot at it. Marcia, you're on.
Well, thank you so much, Leon. I thank you for your making us work so hard today. I thank Women Vote for really doing everything they can to impress upon people the importance of this election. I know we hear every single major election that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. This really is. If we do not vote, if we do not let our voices be heard, then we are going to have what we have. And as someone once said, It is what it is.
I understand. Thank you, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. James Robineau, you're up.
Okay, well, I do think that given the time constraints, we have to trust the post office when people vote. So I would recommend that people go to this website, the BOE.CUYAHOGACOUNTY.GOV, the Board of Elections for Cuyahoga County, sign on, and I know not everybody can do that, but everybody who can, the thing you can do is order your ballot, and then you can track it online. And then once you put your ballot in, you can track it also. So people should feel that they can use the post office, and especially our Board of Elections has a great website to be able to track their votes. So it's very important for people to trust that system and get out and vote.
All right. INAJO Davis-Chappelle, give us your final thought.
Yeah, I want to say as an elections official and administrator, I know that my colleagues on the board join me in wanting to say, please have confidence in our system. We are preparing as best we can in this pandemic, but I would encourage voters you can request your vote by mail application now. Do it now. When we are able to send ballots out beginning October 6th, please, when you receive your ballot, vote them and put them in the mail and or bring them back down to us. We have taken special precautions for people voting in person. We've hired and created a special category of precinct election official that will do nothing but sanitize every voting location. We are taking every step that we can to make sure voting is safe and easy as best we can in these unprecedented times. Do not be discouraged. Please trust us and vote. Thank you. And thanks to Vote Women for allowing me to be a part of the panel. I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Reverend Marvin McMickle, bring us home.
I'd like to draw a political context for why this is an important election. In Kenosha, Wisconsin, there is a man, father of 3, who was shot in the back 7 times, left paralyzed, and was handcuffed to his bed. Paralyzed, handcuffed or ankle cuffed to his bed. The person that shot him was younger than he was, but shot him 7 times. The next day, a young white person of 17 with a semi-automatic weapon opens fire in the middle of a protest and kills 2 people, walks past 4 police vehicles, and goes back home to Illinois, having brought a gun across state lines. And he's being called a hero on Fox News. This is the environment in which we're asking people to vote. If you want to see a continuation of a world that looks like that, stay home or vote in a particular way. If you want to change the look of the world in which we live, vote, and vote in a particular way. We can't go on like this. The world is too divided. We need a moment when we can turn the page. This is that moment.
Indeed, this is that moment. Many thanks, Marvin McMickle and INAJO Davis-Chappelle and James Robineau and Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. Appreciate you being on the broadcast with us today. Our producer is Lorna Wisham, who is program chair for Women Vote. And Lorna, you have a final thought, I know.
Powerful. In a word, today's discussion on the importance of voting was powerful. The goal of Women Vote, a nonpartisan committee of friends, was simply to bring people together to discuss why our vote matters. Our goal was to generate community conversation about the importance of voting, especially in the midst of a pandemic and civil protests we're experiencing around the country. When the idea of virtual panel was suggested, we decided that we needed to have a historical perspective on voting and a conversation on the impact the protests from the 1960s had on the elections. We needed to look at our past to understand our present and open our eyes to the future. Or, as our panelist, Reverend Marvin McMickle said, past is prologue. The one thing we knew for sure was that we wanted Cleveland's best storyteller, Leon Bibb, to be the moderator. Leon, thank you for leading this incredible panel. You were terrific. And to our panelists, INAJO, Jim, Reverend McMickle, and Congresswoman Fudge, what an informed, thought-provoking, and motivating conversation we had today. Your insight on the importance of voting, the historical perspective, and plain facts on voting and the voting process in Northeast Ohio was incredibly valuable to everyone watching. On behalf of Women Vote, thank you for headlining our first panel discussion and delivering such a critical message today. And to our surprise guest, Vice Presidential candidate Senator Kamala Harris, thank you so very much for taking time to support Women Vote in our effort to educate voters in Ohio. As you often say, every eligible voter should make their voices heard. Finally, Women Vote thanks all of you for joining us for today's program. We encourage all Ohioans to participate in the democratic process by doing three things: register to vote, combat voter suppression, and vote absentee by mail. For more information, please visit our website at voteohio2020.com. And remember, your vote matters, everyone's vote matters.